What do you think the current state of the election count is? Is this thing over or what? I read my LA Times today, and in a 20-page first section of the Times, there wasn't a single article about the vote count. So what's the latest news?
Well, I think the honest news, not the hidden news, but the real news is that the election is not determined yet. We have at least 6 states that are in play. We probably have another 2 states that could be in play if they choose to. And I think that my forecast model is at odds with the results. And I really believe my forecast models because I've been forecasting presidential elections since 1976, and I'm usually pretty close to being exactly right.
What do you base your forecasts on?
Well, simply my forecast models, which are proprietary, but they're based on variables that I look at, things like registration dynamics. I look at how the state's registrations are changing for each party. I look at voter intensity. I look at voter enthusiasm, and I have a whole list of other variables. In my book, More Great News for America, I discuss how I build my forecast models.
There's an interesting variable that I had never thought of that a professor from my alma mater, UC Irvine, Marty Wattenberg, who's a forecaster, he mentioned that I hadn't thought of before, is the number of 2016 Trump voters that had passed away, and the number of new whatever gen we're in, Gen Y, that have moved in, right? So your electorate is always moving up 4 years. So you've got the 17 to 21-year-olds that are now voting, 14 to 18-year-olds, right, from the last one that are now voting. And then you've got the people that have passed away. And that shift could be significant.
That's an interesting one. I haven't heard of that. I'm familiar with some of the major forecast models out there. Like there's a professor at Stony Brook University who predicted Trump was going to win this time with 302 electoral votes. And by the way, he was right exactly close last time. And in 2016, my forecast model had Trump winning, and I picked every state correctly that he carried. And I don't think anyone else did that.
Okay, so what did you project for this year?
I predicted that Donald Trump would win with more electoral votes than last time. Last time he got 306. And I predicted he would win more than that, and I honestly believe he did. I do not believe things like Pennsylvania. I mean, if you look at just registration figures alone, and not some of the other variables, there were about 250,000 more registered Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania. That alone should have given him a bigger margin. And I really think the more evidence I read and see, my thought is that the number of states the votes were tampered with, and states were adding votes. And let me give you an example why I believe this. One piece of data. The Pew Research Group, which is a very reputable organization, you're probably familiar with them, and that they found that 96% of Trump voters and Biden voters said that whoever they voted for president, they would also vote down ballot for Senate, same party. So they voted for Trump, they vote for a Republican Senate candidate. They voted for Biden, they vote for the Biden Senate candidate, the Democrat Senate candidate. Well, if you look at the states, you find that, for example, in Georgia, Biden somehow got 95,000 more votes, whereas Trump and his Senate candidates were almost identical on votes. Biden comes up with another 95,000 out of nowhere. When you see those kind of things, you really question statistically what's going on.
Let's stop you right there, because that's a lot of votes. So,
right,
if there's extra Biden votes without the accompanying Senate votes, right, then that tells you that's not a ballot thing, that's a computer thing, right? Or are you saying it's a ballot thing, but they didn't even in those, let's say, fraudulent ballots, they didn't even bother to check the box on senator. The whole idea was just get a bunch of Biden votes in there.
Right. Well, there are affidavits out there that said some people were filling in just the top line and turning the ballots in. So it's possible, sure, that people are manufacturing ballots, sort of the old ballot stuffing.
But what are these? Because I'm really searching for some hard evidence. We're 2 weeks out here, and I think a lot of people are expecting to see some hard evidence very soon. Because if not, they're going to start giving up on this idea that there was genuine fraud? What are these affidavits?
What I did is I went to the lawsuit. I read the lawsuits I could put my hands on, and there you get some real evidence of what they're believing. And according to two of the lawyers for Trump, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, they're presenting more evidence this week. So I say the way to really uncover the evidence is read the lawsuits, because that's where it's being presented to judges. And judges will have to determine, is the evidence adequate to overturn an election, which is what I think they're after.
So let's talk about what's the most compelling things that you've read in reviewing the lawsuits.
Well, there's something called the 14th Amendment, which everybody's familiar with, Civil War type amendment. And it has, among other things, equal protection of the laws. In other words, everybody should be treated fairly. Voting is a civil rights. It's a right of every American citizen, and they should be treated fairly. In the state of Michigan, for example, in a number of counties that were Democrat-run counties, they would not allow Republican voters to cure their ballots. But they did go out of their way to call people ahead of the election, Democrats who had faulty ballots, and they were able to cure them. That alone is a reason to throw out the results in Michigan when you don't have equal protection of the laws.
Okay, so again, I'm looking for hard evidence. So whenever you bring up something, I'm going to probe a little bit. So in Michigan, you're saying that on mail-in ballots, if somebody, let's say they forgot to sign it, just as a simple example, okay, you're saying that Michigan poll workers would call the person
in Democratic counties.
In Democratic counties.
You know, around the big cities like Detroit and that, where you have a lot of Democrats.
And would actually reach out to the person and say, hey, you know, you're going to need to vote again.
And they did. And Republicans were not allowed to do that, and they didn't do that for Republicans if they were running them from the Democratic strongholds.
Let's talk about the poll workers for a second, because I think this is kind of interesting as far as who these people are. Because I was surprised a lot of times the reporters there, and they're talking about how hard they're working. And of course, they're working during COVID. And many times the reporter would say, and these are volunteers. And now that kind of surprised me. Like, wait a minute, on something as important as vote count, they're relying on volunteers to do this? Yeah. That surprised me.
Well, I'll tell you, I've done that in my life too. You know, I've had a sort of a political side to me during my career, and I was an elector for Ronald Reagan, and I helped in the Ronald Reagan 76 campaign, also the 80 campaign. And during the way along the road, I was, you know, things like delegate to conventions, and I've also been a poll watcher. I've also had judge training and poll watcher training. So
okay, but that's poll watching on behalf of the Republican Party.
Right. Well, that's normally what happens. Each party identifies people that they trust to be there. And when you see a state do it properly, they'll have an election judge sitting in the middle. They'll have a Republican maybe on the left. Well, maybe that's the wrong side. They'll have a Democrat on the left, and they'll have a Republican on the right. And they'll both be watching and making sure everything's on the up and up. There's no, you know, the ballot gets through that looks weird, you know, or did something wrong. So they have people on both sides. The problem becomes like in Philadelphia, where they had widespread not reluctance, they pushed Republican poll watchers out the door. They wouldn't allow them within a reasonable distance. They said that some of them literally would need binoculars to see the ballots. They were so far away.
How close were you when you were judging ballots?
Next to them.
There was no space restriction.
No, next to people and next to my counterpart judge or counterpart Democrat. That's the normal way. That's equal protection, where both sides are there to challenge anything that's funny. And then when you've done counting, you have some confidence that, gee whiz, our votes were right. We stood there for hours doing this.
Right. So that, you know, I know that's been a big one that Giuliani has been pointing out, talking about 130,000 ballots in Philadelphia. But don't you think if you're the judge on this, the remedy, if that was a problem, is to recount them with the observers closer?
Well, the problem is when they remove the ballot from the envelope, and you're not able to go back and see the envelope that goes with a particular ballot. And was there a signature on that envelope? Did it have a correct date if it was postmarked? That's another problem in Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court, which are a bunch of elected Democrats, I think it's 5-2 Democrats elected in Pennsylvania, they said, well, it's okay if it comes in past 8 p.m. on election day, which is state law. And they said it's okay if it has a faulty or defective postmark. It's okay if it's illegible. It's okay if it doesn't have a signature. Well, those judges were rewriting the state law. And Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says the legislature has the right and the authority to set laws for the electors. And when the state of Pennsylvania had these laws, it was up to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to follow them, but they chose not to. And that's why ultimately Justice Alito of the Supreme Court came in. And I think ultimately why Pennsylvania is going to be thrown out for Biden. And those 20 electoral votes are going to go to Trump.
Okay, so sticking with Pennsylvania, it definitely seems like this court ruling is quite questionable. In fact, let me ask you, I don't know if you've read the ruling, but let's just start with what was the basis for a court to say that, I know the legislature said it has to be received by election day, not postmarked, received, but we're going to say it's okay as long as it's postmarked by election day. What was the reasoning of that court?
Well, you'd call that an activist judge. They're making law. There is no basis.
Yeah, but they had to have some explanation as to why they were modifying it. Was it a COVID-related thing, or what was the rationale there? Do you know?
I didn't read their original ruling to tell you precisely. I don't know. It might have been COVID. It might have been they felt like because of COVID, people needed more time. It doesn't really matter what they thought.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm just curious.
I mean, they're making up laws. You can't do that.
Okay, but still, that means that any ballots that came in after Election Day would be the ones that would be tossed out. And do we know how many ballots that is? Because I've heard that's a pretty modest number.
Justice Alito demanded that they segregate the ballots. So we should be able to find out if they did that. In fact, if they didn't, and they violated a court order like that, that's reason for throwing it out.
So we would need, because it looks like the count is Biden won Pennsylvania by about 69,000 votes. So
right, and Trump was ahead by 700,000 going into the overnight hours.
Yeah, but he was also... Yeah, but Biden was way ahead in Florida early, and then Trump overcame him. So I think these states all went in different directions based on when they counted the mail-in. You had this huge discrepancy between...
Trump was way ahead early in Florida. You must not have seen all the numbers.
Trump?
Trump was way ahead in Florida.
All I know is I was watching Florida very closely, and at about 50% counted, Trump was down. Trump made a big comeback in the last 50%. I mean, that's my specific recollection of watching the election results that night. Maybe I'm misremembering, but, I think, some of these states, we know Pennsylvania counted the mail-ins after the in-persons. I think Florida probably counted the mail-ins before the in-persons, and hence the reason why you would get that flip. I mean, look, we can't dispute the fact that mail-ins were heavy Biden and in-person was favored Trump, right? So obviously... My point is, I'm not going to say that, oh my gosh, this is fraudulent because all of a sudden Trump was winning big and then he lost. There's an easy explanation for that. That's the fact that the mail-in ballots were heavy Biden, and you have to count the mail-in ballots. I just don't like that as our argument that it's fraudulent.
No, well, I think you have to put everything together, and you have to put all the pieces together, the timing of it, and you also have to put together if extraneous ballots showed up. The claim in Wisconsin, for example, is that, how many was it? I think it was 62,000 ballots showed up at 4 a.m. and changed the numbers then. And that, by the way, is a statistical issue for me as well, because you look at statistics, and I'm a numbers guy, and you see the normal give and take of balloting. If you watch minute by minute, the numbers coming in, they go up a little bit for one, they go up a little for the other person, back and forth. But then, overnight, between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., you see sudden jumps of outrageously large numbers for one person only. that looks extremely suspicious. And then when you get on this, on the ground, people who said we saw, 3 cars pull up with 61 boxes of ballots for Biden, and there wasn't one Trump ballot. Those kind of affidavits lend credence to the statistical analysis.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, at the end of the day, we're going to need the hard evidence because right now I know a lot of people think I think a lot of people think it smells fishy, and I'm certainly very open to this review. I think it's excellent that we're going to have this audit and finally find out what's going on. We know there are fraudulent ballots. I think no one would disagree that there's some level of fraud, that there's at least one fraudulent ballot, right? So if you can believe there's one fraudulent ballot, then the question is, how many fraudulent ballots are there? And let's finally get to the bottom of this and find out. And if it turns out that the fraud was minimal, then great, we learned that. If it turns out the fraud was more than minimal, then we learned that. But let's find out.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do know in Nevada, for example, there are thousands of people who were not in state, and there are a few of those who were military, and that's fine. They were out of state and voted, but the others who had moved out of the state shouldn't be counted. Also, we've looked at the national database of deaths, and that compared to ballots, and it turns out a lot of those people who are dead voted, and that's the problem. Now,
having overseen ballot counting before,
right?
How do they catch that on the day of? I mean, it just seems to me you're counting millions of ballots. Are you telling me the signature is compared every single time? Yes.
In reputable states where they do it by the book, they do. They have the signatures, and they even allow for a little bit, people's signatures change slightly. And what they would do, for example, in my state, Colorado, is your signature differs a little bit too much, you get a call after the election, like the next day, and you're saying, did you have a stroke? Did you break your arm? Why is your signature different? And they better have a good reason.
And by the way, is that for an in-person vote or for a mail-in vote?
Either. All ballots, in Colorado, there's really no longer many in-person votes. It's rare. Because in Colorado, 100% of the voter registration file is sent a ballot. And so normally everybody just signs an envelope and deposits it in the mail or at a voter center.
Right. And then if you go to vote in person, California's the same way. So we get, I don't know what the percentages are, but probably 70% are mail-in. But for the people that go to the poll, what is the means of identification typically?
They have a voter, a book of signatures. They've got a book of registrations, and you better be in it.
So you go in, you give your name. I know there's all this controversy over whether you should have to show an ID or not. Seems like a no-brainer that you should show an ID, but
in 100 countries in the world, you have to use voter ID. Why don't we use it?
Right. So instead, we just walk into the poll room and give our name, right? Name and address?
Depends on the state.
And then they look you up to see that you're on there. And then you probably sign your name next to.
Yeah, next to your name.
So that's our identification. That's our I mean, signatures today, we hardly use, even with a credit card, most of the time they don't require a signature anymore.
The banks don't require a signature on credit cards. Some stores do. I don't know why, because it's not really necessary anymore. They just go by the credit card itself.
I know when I do sign my signature on something, I just scribble something and it wouldn't match anything. And I think a lot of people do that. It's just such an antiquated way of security these days.
Well, a thumbprint would be better. We could go to that system. Boy, would that really cut down on fraud. Because thumbprints don't match. I mean, you can't really fake it. And
a computer could easily check that, you would think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. In the past, give me an example of major voter fraud that has been uncovered in an election, whether it be presidential or other, Senate, Congress, major fraud that's been uncovered in voting.
Well, I believe Nixon Kennedy, the Mayor Daley was famous in Chicago for seeing to it that Democrats would win the city of Chicago. And a lot of people feel that he waited to turn in more ballots for Kennedy so that Nixon would lose Illinois. Same thing happened in Texas. And Nixon didn't want to put the country into a crisis by challenging it, and he conceded. But probably Nixon won in 1960.
Did Nixon, how many states did he lose by?
Two.
Two?
Illinois and Texas.
So he would have had to overturn both Texas and Illinois.
Right.
And do you happen to recall the number of votes that were at stake there? How much he lost
That
by?
year, I'd have to look it up. I don't remember it.
But anyway, they were pretty close. Probably he lost by about a point or something like that in each one of them.
Oh, you mean the number of percentage? Oh, it's very close, extremely close. It might have been 100,000 votes each.
Was there at least a recount?
No recount. He didn't challenge. He conceded. It would be as if Trump conceded right away, immediately on Wednesday, which he didn't do.
So there was never any investigation into that alleged fraud then?
No formal investigation, no legal investigation. There might have been some people that tried to, historians that wanted to know for themselves.
And was the belief there that it was dead people voting?
A lot of them, yes.
And how do you, again, I'm trying to get to hard evidence here. So in just walking through how this happens, right? So you've got dead people on the roll. So who is voting for these dead people? How does this happen?
Well, for example, let's take a state that mails out their entire registration rolls and sends each one on the roll a ballot. Some people have died. Some people have moved out of state. And there may be other reasons why they may have moved to a different city within the state and they shouldn't be registered in San Diego now or whatever. They should have a registration in LA maybe, let's say. Okay, so those things happen, but the votes go. I heard someone in California say for this election, he lived in an apartment building. He said, I received 5 ballots at my apartment, his own, and 4 others. And he said he figured the other 4 must have previously lived and given that address, and that's why they were sent there. So he had 5 ballots. Now, if you're an honest person, you throw out the other 4. You don't try to vote for them. But what can happen is somebody died and their house, maybe they want to make sure that somebody gets elected, so they put in an extra vote. That's how it happens.
Yeah. Now, theoretically, it should be tossed out because the signature doesn't match, because the person would have to know that person's signature.
Right, exactly. But they're not always checked. A lot of states are eliminating the voter verification with signature, which I'm against.
But if that were the basis for the fraud, that's kind of onesie-twosie kind of stuff, because that could have shown up in a
it's like 1,000 or 2,000. It's not.
Yeah, but here's my point though. That's not organized fraud. That's an individual deciding, oh, I got an extra ballot, I'm going to vote. And by the way, he could be a Trump voter. So, kind of equal chance he could have been Trump or Biden there. So it doesn't seem to me that's going to account for enough to overturn what needs to be overturned in these states. So, I think what is going to need to be uncovered is organized, premeditated fraud. Right.
Well, let me bring up a point you haven't brought up yet. Might as well mention it as premeditated fraud. And that is the Dominion software. The Trump campaign says that they have evidence they're presenting to the courts this week that the software had a backdoor. And the backdoor was put in intentionally. The software is owned by someone who is now on the Biden transition team. This is a software used in 30 states, used all over Michigan. And it's software, they say, has a backdoor where you can monitor the voting and decide how many more to add to one side or the other. Now, that would be organized. That would be definitely criminal.
Yeah,
and
well, it does raise the question. This is another question I had for you, is that, we know that dictators steal elections around the world.
Sure.
Putin gets 92% of the vote. The guy in Venezuela, I don't know what he gets. So do we believe that that's people that are just scared to not vote for Putin, or we think that that is election fraud?
Oh, I think it's election fraud.
And how do we, has there ever been any stories or analysis as to how it happens? In other words, does it happen through some type of software program like Dominion?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, my understanding is, and again, I'm looking to the lawsuits to give me more information too when they release it, and that is that a Venezuelan company was on contract with a number of our states to do our vote counting for us. If that's true, I would expect it even more likely to be fraudulent.
Yeah. And then the question is this the first time, if there was this type of fraud, is this the first time, or has it been multiple times?
I think they have evidence, it goes back, that it's happened in other elections, and they have proof on that too. So I think if there's something here, it's big, and if it's big, it's going to be another deep state, if you will, scandal that's being surfaced. And we're going to have to wait and see if that's the truth or not. I don't know. You know, ultimately, I'm an analyst. I'm a numbers guy. I analyze numbers. I can't guarantee, you know, every number that somebody gives me is correct. And we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But I think a lot's going to happen in the next couple of weeks.
Let's go back to talking about the poll workers, because
Sure.
I mentioned that a lot of them are volunteers. But
Right, they
again,
are.
I'm talking about not the people that are volunteering for the Republican or Democrat Party. I'm talking about the actual vote counters. Now, that's what the reporters kept saying. I don't know if that was true or not. Do you happen to know, and I'm sure each state is different, whether these poll workers are volunteers or they're paid?
They're both. There are a lot of people. For example, I'll take Colorado since I know it very well. I'm very intimate with this state. In Colorado, the judges are typically paid by the local county. You know, every election is really a county election in the United States. There are 3,000 counties. And each county, you know, we don't have a national election that everybody votes for president and it's all run by the federal government. It's run by counties. And in a county, they normally pay the judges, and they'll have Republican judges and Democrat judges who are paid a fee, $50 to work a day or $100, whatever the amount is. And they're the principal counters, and they watch everything very closely. And they're trained by their parties to do the job. And they're also trained by the county to follow the state laws and the county laws. Okay, then in addition, they have poll watchers. And poll watchers, election judges are normally paid. Poll watchers are normally free. They're volunteers, they care, they want to help, but it's, you know, they may only have 3 hours, they don't have 12 hours. So
and sorry to interrupt. Are you saying that the judges are either Republican or Democrat? They always make sure there's one of each?
Yes, normally, yeah. How else can it be fair?
Yeah, well, I mean, you would think it should be a non-partisan, apolitical position. We're supposed to just have blinders on and do vote counting, not be able be thinking politics.
People who are full-time employees of a county clerk or a secretary of state, the full-time employees are supposed to be nonpartisan. There's no guarantee. There's a good chance they were hired for political reasons, and some would lean one way or the other. They're supposed to be objective no matter what by law and that. But the judges are normally partisan and usually equal representation. And if you don't see equal representation, that's a problem.
So have you followed the story about Mark Zuckerberg and his $400 million that he...
Yeah, I'm a little familiar with it, not an expert on it.
I thought it was pretty fascinating. So basically, under the COVID stimulus, I forget what that was called, but there was money allocated to help the vote count. I presume because they were anticipating we were going to have a lot more mail-in due to COVID, and states were going to need more support. So I think it was about $400 million that was allocated to the states to help with vote counting in the stimulus package. And then Zuckerberg decides that, well, that's not enough. You know, probably the Democrats had thought a lot more money needed to be spent. And so Zuckerberg steps forward and says, well, you know, the vote count is sacred and so important. And so I'm going to contribute $400 million to this entity which maybe you know the name of. I could dig it up if we need to. I forget the name of the entity. But when you look up this entity that he gave the $400 million to, that's going to help the vote count around the country, it's a progressive Obama, official run organization. So it's clear that this organization, their intention is to make sure that we get votes counted in the places that we need votes counted in. So I don't know if you've looked into that much or what you know about.
I don't know if there's anything fraudulent. I think that the places where he supported them, I think they voted for Biden. But then I think he picked places that were probably Democrat to start with.
Sure. I mean, that would be the way to affect the election is, it's all part of get out the vote, right?
Yeah, actually, what I think a lot of people don't realize, too, is that Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter really made huge in-kind contributions to the Biden campaign just by basically suppressing any news that was negative on him and or suppressing people knowing negative things about him, but playing up anything bad about Trump, and also shutting down Trump. Trump's vehicle for communicating with the American people, whether people liked it or not, was Twitter. And when they started, cutting every tweet down or saying that's false information, that was really an in-kind contribution. And I'm against censorship of any kind. I'm a First Amendment guy, and I do not think anybody should censor people's political opinions.
Well, 100% agree. That's the whole reason that they've got the exemption from defamation suits, is to allow it to be an open platform to say whatever the heck you want. But instead,
not that way in this election.
Instead, they're editing and censoring, and that puts you in the role now as a publisher and should change whether they can be sued for defamation or not.
Yeah.
So,
when they did that about, for example, back in the heyday of COVID, and what drugs you should use or don't use, and they wanted to censor doctors, that put them in the business of giving medical advice to their listeners. I would think that's a liability in itself, to say, oh, don't use that hydroxychloroquine or chlorine, whatever it is, because that won't do anything for you. They have no right to say that. Let the doctors speak for themselves.
Oh, and trust me, we've done an episode or two on that. There's plenty of doctors who say that it's absolutely what you should be taking, and you should be taking it at the earliest sign of anything. And if people had been doing, with a combination of zinc, and if people had been doing that, the hospitalization rate would have gone way down.
Yeah, I mean, after all, a software engineer is supposed to be the equivalent of medical doctors, specialists. I think it's utterly ridiculous that they'd censor anybody.
Yeah. So, I think one explanation, for instance, why your modeling was off.
I don't think my modeling was off.
Well, but you projected a Trump victory, and we don't have a Trump victory.
Well, so, I think it still may happen.
I agree, but I'm just saying, either it was fraud, right? Which would have made your models wrong because you didn't project fraud, I presume.
I do predict fraud in my models, but not that much. I predict like the little bit, like you said, about 1,000 here and there, dead people voting. I figure there's always some of that. So I put some of that in, but I don't put in hundreds of thousands of votes dropping on somebody's lap in the middle of the night.
Right. So I'm just proposing that the reason the numbers don't match your numbers, could either be widespread fraud.
Yes.
Or I'm going to ask this as a question. It could be people like Zuckerberg, and I'm sure these are not the only dollars. There's probably hundreds of other millions of dollars that I'm not aware of, but Zuckerberg's 400 million, which is basically essentially get out the vote campaigns. I mean, the percentage of voters supposedly in the inner city was extremely high, like 91%, I read somewhere. So they were getting out the vote in the inner cities, which is where you should focus if you're a Democrat. And perhaps they did an astounding job, maybe so astounding that it borders on illegal, because there's certain things that are allowed and not. They talk about ballot harvesting, and can you knock on doors and help somebody fill out their ballot and this or that. Who knows? Maybe some of the stuff they actually did was illegal, but they had a very concerted effort to get out the vote in the inner cities.
So did Trump. Trump had a great organization. Biden had no ground game whatsoever. And we know that Trump got 10 million more votes than he got in 2016. So he managed to get 10 million more
Well,
people.
Biden himself wasn't out there giving speeches, but as far as ground game, I mean,
They didn't. They didn't do door to door. They're people around. That's what they were so.
Isn't that what the Democratic Party does?
I thought that he lost Florida because they didn't have people getting out the vote in Florida.
But
they
I mean,
themselves complained. I'm quoting them.
Isn't the Democratic Party though notorious for being pretty good at community organizing and knocking on doors? And
Barack Obama was. Joe Biden isn't.
But it's the Democratic Party.
Well, I'm sorry. They just didn't have a campaign. I think that was a political strategy decision they made. They did not have a good ground game. And I don't think they did a good job. And some of their alternatives, like you said, Zuckerberg, some of them may have done something to help him, but his own campaign didn't.
Well, I mean, some of these progressive organizations are huge and getting I mean, look at the money that Black Lives Matter gets. Where'd all that money go?
Oh, I guess that goes into the coffers for future rioting.
Well, it also goes to a lot of Democratic candidates. So I think a lot of it was spent on political campaigns.
Yeah, that's possible.
And, the George Soros funded organizations.
Those are significant too. Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, talk about that to the extent because George Soros is notorious, my understanding, for supporting very local elections. The local district attorney, they want a progressive district attorney. We got that here in LA. We had a very progressive district attorney, and she lost to the guy from San Francisco, who's even more progressive. We have a very progressive LA city council, but one of the city council members was ousted by another even more progressive person. An incumbent lost, which is very rare. But Soros money is going to a lot of these type of campaigns.
Yeah, that's true. He was going for a while for secretaries of state because he knew how powerful they were in influencing election results. And he also, for a while, including more recently, for DA, district attorneys, because he wanted progressive DAs. Those are people who wanted bail reform, eliminate bail. They're talking about eliminating misdemeanors in some locations where you can't commit a misdemeanor. That's going to create a lot of havoc and a lot of problems when you eliminate essentially law and order.
Yeah.
And it also, I think they also were decided, for example, in Portland, not to go ahead and pursue certain crimes. The fellow who was killed, I think he was in a shoot-off with the police who were trying to catch him after he had hurt someone else. He had been arrested and they didn't charge him with anything, so he got let out, and I think it was on a gun charge, and he eventually wound up, I think, shooting someone and killing them, a Trump supporter. And that crime could have been committed had they kept him in jail the first time. But instead, they just didn't pursue any charges. So these liberal district attorneys, I should say socialist, I think that fits them better. That's something that George Soros and his various funded organizations seem to pursue and have a lot of money. Also, I might add, there's an enormous amount of money that's gone into Act Blue, which is suspicious money from my perspective, because a lot of people list themselves who donate money to Act Blue as not having any jobs. So a lot of unemployed people are donating to Act Blue, which is money that goes to Democrat candidates. And we had 3 Senate candidates where the Democrats raised $100 million, and each one of them, by the way, lost. And I have a theory that you can't buy an election in America. People will wise up and know a whole lot of money is coming from outside to influence elections. And I think that's what happened with those 3 Senate races. One was Lindsey Graham. He had $109 million brought in against him.
Yeah. Act Blue was the organization I was thinking of. That's my understanding is where most of the Black Lives Matter money goes is to Act Blue. So apparently if you click on donate on Black Lives Matter, people could confirm this. It's taking you to the Act Blue website. So tell me what is Act Blue? How long has this thing been around, if you know, and who's the organizer of that thing?
Oh, I don't have a history of it. I spend my time on elections, not on people funding it. There's an organization called Act Blue that basically is an opportunity for people to donate to blue causes. And they apparently distribute the money. I don't know how they do it. I'm not sure how they, if they get 100 million one year, I don't know how they divide it up.
Basically, a big Democratic PAC.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
And
back to money influencing elections. I tend to agree with you. However, the exception to that might be these smaller elections where nobody knows who the heck these two people are anyway. So the only way they really are able to distinguish themselves is if they're able to spend enough money to build up name recognition. And that might be why, in part why Soros focuses on those.
Yeah, well, that's possible. He has won. A number of DAs he supported have won over the years.
So just to wrap up on the election numbers, and then we'll talk about the future a little bit. You talk about your modeling and so on. So these are very rough numbers, but it looks like around 160 million votes were cast, and 100 million of them were mail-in, compared to 4 years earlier, just 33 million mail-in ballots. So you have 3 times as many mail-in ballots, and they went big time for Biden. So that's a pretty good explanation right there. Now, could be fraudulent ballots. We'll find out. But when you were modeling this, were you expecting that many mail-in ballots, 3 times more than 4 years ago?
I don't distinguish between how a vote gets voted. So I did not model for mail-in versus in-person versus drop-off or any other way of voting. My attempt is to understand how many people are in a state and how they are leaning, what trends are driving them, that sort of thing. If I look at other kinds of numbers, then the mechanism they vote.
Now that
a new variable to look at.
Huh? Sorry?
It could be a new variable I should look at in the future.
Yeah, it seems like
it's never been a variable of significance.
I mean, let's think about it this way. If it's harder, let's just, I don't know if this is true or not, but it could be true. If it's harder for, let's say, poor people to get to the polls, let's say they got to take a bus to get there, which is no fun. So, but now the ballot's sitting in their house, and all they got to do is fill it out in their house. Maybe mail-in balloting ends up getting more Democrat votes.
Or maybe we should go back to the way it was, where you had balloting in each individual precinct. So like you walk down the block to your neighbor's house and they had a precinct office, not a precinct office, but they used their precinct for voting. Or sometimes it was a school, elementary school. Or sometimes it was a church in the neighborhood. Used to be we had voting places in each precinct. We no longer have that. That's been eliminated. That's one of the many so-called reforms.
That must be a Colorado thing, because we still have them here. I mean, my local voting place is a local church that's about half a mile away.
Well, I think it depends by state and that. In a way, since I'm not as familiar with California, I don't live there, it surprises me, given all your other reforms, that you even bother with voting in a church.
Well, and that's, as we look forward in the future elections, this is not going to change. If anything, mail-in voting is probably going to increase, right? All these states that implemented it for the first time due to COVID are probably going to keep it.
That could be very well. And if it helps Democrats to win, I'm sure that they would prefer to keep it that way, the ones who are running those places.
Yeah. I mean, it was astounding percentage-wise how heavy it was for Biden, assuming it's legitimate. A lot of people think that it's because, these Democrats tend to fear COVID more than Republicans, perhaps because they watch CNN instead of Fox. and so they didn't want to go to the polls, even though they go to the grocery store, no problem, but they didn't want to stand 6 feet behind somebody wearing a mask to go vote. Right. And so that explains the more Biden mail-in votes.
Let me ask you a question. You actually can vote in a church? Even though I thought churches were sort of like persona non grata with Governor Newsom. In other words, people weren't allowed to go to church to worship. Are they allowed to go to church to vote?
Well, I did mail in. I did mail in this year, but yes, it's actually a Christian elementary school that is where I voted in the past, and you walk into some room there and vote. But yeah, you would think that'd be very controversial in California, right? That we're using Christian school to vote in. So you're very concerned about the rise of socialism in America, as am I. Totally antithetical to what America is all about. That's why I'm just like, when Bernie Sanders almost beats Hillary Clinton, I'm thinking to myself, man, what are people learning? How could you vote for a socialist if you're an American? It's just the two just don't go together. But what do you see, assuming the Republicans keep the Senate, so some balance is held there, assuming they keep the Senate, what are you still concerned that Biden will do to move this country in a socialist direction?
Well, I think he got his support from the progressives. I think he's being pressured by AOC and Elizabeth Warren and others to follow progressive. And by the way, the word progressive, let's call spade a spade. The word progressive means progress towards socialism. That's what they're after. And the goal is ultimately socialism. That means things like government-controlled medical care for all. It means, free cell phones, free everything, free child care, guaranteed income for everybody, regardless of whether or not they choose to work. It's sort of
guaranteed housing.
Yeah, housing.
Guaranteed jobs.
Everything.
Just government takes care of everything.
Right. And by the way, that's precisely the program that Democrat socialist Hugo Chavez promised to the Venezuelan people. And remember, that was 1998. And at that time, Venezuela was probably the richest nation in best economy in South America, is now a poverty-stricken basket case. Because Hugo Chavez promised everything to everybody, and they thought it sounded great, all this stuff for free. And he nationalized the industries, he socialized everything, and he wound up turning them into bankruptcy where they can't even produce enough food for themselves, and they can't provide for their own needs. And I think that's what would happen here too. And I just hope that there'd be enough sense in the Senate to not go along with it, because I think my book, I studied socialism. I have behind me, this is part of my library. You can see part of it here. I have an enormous library on socialism, and my knowledge of it, and I think I captured it well in the book, is that every socialist experiment has failed. You can mention any one you want, including the ones that temporarily paraded as socialist in the Swedish countries, Denmark, those kind of countries. They've all failed, and they all wind up not only corrupting their economy, but corrupting the morality. You always get moral and economic bankruptcy from socialism over the years that it has been tried.
What do you say to people such as, I think, Bernie Sanders, who says, well, we just want European-style socialism?
What's that?
Or Scandinavian. I mean, the ones people tend to point to are Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
What they have is not socialism. What they have is a welfare state that's funded by capitalism. They were going downhill fast, their economies, and if they hadn't picked up some free market reforms and put in some capitalist ideas, they would be bankrupt too, like Venezuela. They had to switch away from socialism.
So tell us a little bit about that, because this is a real point of confusion for people, because it's very easy to listen to Bernie and say, yeah, what's wrong with those countries? We should be more like those countries. And he says that's all he's talking about. So talk to us about what are some of the things that they had implemented going toward real socialism that they had to then unwind.
Oh, gosh. Well, for one thing, they had high taxes. The amount of tax, I think they had 25% tax on a car. They had all sorts of things that were just really tough on their economy. And they tried to...
income taxes as high as 70, 80% kind of thing?
Yeah, those kind of things. And I actually do a good job of putting it in the book. And if you want to read about it and get a lot of detail and answer, I'd like to answer your question with the book, but I have to read it to you. You know, there's a lot of data in there. It's full of data. It's got 250, I think, footnotes. That's a lot of references. And the book is called Real World Socialism. It's on Amazon. It's in print edition. It's also in Kindle edition if you prefer Kindle, electronic. And it's available in books wherever you want to buy books. And I go through and go into detail why it failed. It failed, another examples in the kibbutz, you know, Israel. There are a number of people that believed in socialism back there in the 1940s, and they tried it, and it worked for a while as long as it was subsidized by the free market Israeli economy. When the government subsidized it, those little kibbutzes, which are like little socialist towns, if you will, they were able to work. But you know what? They didn't work over time, and when they were no longer subsidized, they shut down. Why? Because people didn't want to work for free. The people who had talent, they thought they weren't getting paid enough, and they left and went to other parts of Israel where they get a regular job and regular pay. And the people who were kind of loafers and didn't do anything, they would stay there. They liked getting something for free, but they weren't producing anything, so it just didn't work. And that's what happens if you look all around at socialism. It just fails. And it fails because it violates human nature.
What do you say to people who, believe it or not, will actually point to China to say that that's a model of success, that we should be following how China's doing? Because, wow, look how great China's doing, and they're about to be the largest economy in the world.
Well, what I'd start with and say, look at where they're standing on. They killed roughly 25 million people in their Great Famine because of their socialist ideas. The torture that has gone on in China has been horrific. The stories just make you sick to your stomach about how people have been treated. Their low opinion of and low thoughts of human life is just incredibly awesome. I've read it and I've seen it, pictures, and it's just horrible. I'd say it's a horrible country, and people are afraid to do things. It's got all sorts of corruption, which is socialist, and it'll never compete against us. We'll beat it.
Well, and one thing that I say, you tell me if you agree, is that, yes, it's had a resurgence in the past 25 years or whatever number of years, but that's primarily because it has implemented some modicum of free markets. And that's the explanation as to why it's doing better now.
That's true, and that's why they did a little better, but they also now are involved in getting rid of some of those reforms because they don't really like giving anybody freedom.
And then last thing, just to talk about socialism versus communism. Am I right that if you look at, say, the Soviet Union, which is kind of the model of what people called communism, really never became communist? Wasn't it really just socialist? I mean, walk us through the difference there.
Well, let's talk about the two words. Okay, Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels in 1848, those two are the ones who really pushed socialism and got it sort of going. It existed before that, but they really pushed it as a philosophy. They believe socialism equals communism. Sometimes people would refer to socialism as the step preceding communism, as if there were a difference. But Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels thought they were equivalent. If you had socialism, you had communism. If you had communism, you had socialism. And I still believe that's the case. And Lenin,
well, let me just ask you this, so people are aware, and it's been a while since I've studied all of this, but none, the two terms existed. So how would you describe socialism versus communism to Marx?
Well,
how would he describe socialism versus communism? Sorry.
They would consider them synonyms. Karl Marx would consider the two words equal.
Okay. And whereas others would say what?
Others would say, some would say that they thought that socialism could exist with religion and communism couldn't. They might say, for example, some socialist countries will allow religion, and But yet, if you look at Karl Marx, he was an atheist. And socialism is really its own little religion where the government is all powerful, not God. And where the government, you look to the government for everything instead of looking to God. You know, you pray to the government instead of praying to God. Mm-hmm. So I would say some people thought that that was the difference. Some people thought that communism was more reflective of totalitarianism, you know, implemented more dictatorial, more murders, more torture. And some people thought socialism was sort of communism light, you know, less than that. But an awful lot of socialist countries turned out to be pretty tough, too.
What I have in my head from my time studying this was that you've got this move through, and I guess it was from socialism to communism, but that you had the dictatorship of the proletariat, where there's this period of time when you need to redistribute wealth. You know, you got to get rid of the rich people and you got to redistribute their wealth to everybody because it's a commune. Everybody should be equally sharing in everything, right? So you've got this period in which the state needs to implement this, and through coercive, oppressive means, there's no other way to implement taking somebody's wealth and giving it to somebody else. And that eventually, so that would require an authoritarian government. But then ultimately you would move to this other level where it was the people. Now the commune is complete and we have, I presume, communism at that point, and everybody's working together and nobody's oppressing anybody.
It doesn't work. Everywhere tried, it doesn't work.
Of course not.
And there's a lot of people like Bernie will say, well, so-and-so, you know, Venezuela didn't do it the right way. Well, they did it the right way. They followed Karl Marx. They'd say Lenin didn't do it the right way. Well, he was a big advocate for Karl Marx and socialism. And they might say Joseph Stalin didn't do it the right way. Well, everybody didn't do it the right way, did they? Or else they all did it exactly right because they all followed it. Socialism just doesn't work. That's the bottom line of the book I wrote.
What I find stunning is these people like Zuckerberg and other media titans, multi-billionaires, who don't realize that these people that you're supporting, these progressive / socialists, they're coming for you, homeboy.
Yeah.
You don't deserve what you've got. You made it off the sweat and tears of the worker, and in a racist society that your white privilege put you in the position to achieve. And what happens in these socialist revolutions is all the wealthy people have to get the hell out of the country. So Zuckerberg, they're coming for you, buddy. The guys that you're giving all this money to.
Yeah.
But maybe he, I have a theory though, that maybe he knows that and they're kind of just buying time, that maybe by paying them off, I'm like, hey guys, I'm with you. Don't come and take my house from me. You know, it's almost like an insurance policy. I'm worth $20 billion. You know what? I'll peel off $1 billion and give it to these guys. They're paying, it's protection money.
Right. Well, I think that's the reason the corporations have supported BLM. I think the donations to BLM are money to be left alone. I really do. I think Zuckerberg, I'll say something else about, and this is maybe slightly different than what you're saying, and that is they remind me of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was a great economist and philosopher of the 20th century. And Hayek wrote a book called The Fatal Conceit, where the people who are running things sort of think they're so smart, they're smarter than the average person, they can do everything better. And I think maybe that's what Zuckerberg thinks. He's doing his part to do everything better, and he's going to make the world good by censoring all those stupid conservatives who don't know as much as he does. And that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's the Bloomberg.
Totally wrong.
It's the Bloomberg mentality. You should not have a 16-ounce soda because it's not good for you. And I'm like, well, thanks, Jeff, for your opinion, but sorry, I'm going to make my own decision about my own body. You're not going to tell me what I can eat. But they are so much smarter than the rest of us, right, that they need to tell us what to eat and what to drink.
Yeah, like, for example, the Barack Obama advisor on Affordable Care Act. What's his name? I'm trying to think of what his name was. But at any rate, he said basically the American people are too stupid to tell them the truth about healthcare. You have to just spring it on them.
Right.
And that's the fatal conceit, thinking they know more than anybody else, which is ridiculous.
Thank you again to our guest, George Lamero. You can check out his book, Real World Socialism, that has just come out, Real World Socialism, on Amazon. We highly suggest that you check out that book as well as his other books, all available on Amazon. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you to our intern, Jake Wall. And we look forward to bringing you another episode soon of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.